There is a version of you that already exists, not in the future, not as a goal, not as a reward waiting at the end of a long enough streak of discipline and sacrifice. Right now, parallel to the version sitting here reading this, a version of you that moves through the world differently, makes decisions differently, responds to setbacks, to rejection, to uncertainty differently. That version doesn't have more information than you, doesn't have better circumstances, doesn't have a cleaner past or a more forgiving starting point. The only difference, the single variable that separates that version from the one you're currently living, is that they stopped treating the outcome as uncertain, not because they had proof it would work, because they made a decision, quiet, private, total, that losing was simply not a category they operated in anymore. You've heard versions of this before. Act as if. Fake it till you make it. Believe before you see. And every time you've heard it, something in you has resisted. Because those phrases sound like instructions to deceive yourself, to pretend, to perform confidence you haven't earned in front of an audience that hasn't been fooled. That resistance is intelligent. It's protecting you from delusion. But it's also protecting you from something else. Something Napoleon Hill spent 20 years watching the wealthiest, most resilient minds in human history do, not as a performance, not as a psychological trick, but as a deeply reasoned, deliberately chosen relationship with reality. He called it acting with definiteness, and it is almost nothing like what you've been told. What he observed was not pretending, not self-deception, not manufactured bravado. It was a specific internal posture that the most successful people he studied had developed, a posture that made them functionally incapable of being stopped by the things that stop everyone else. Not because they never failed, because failure to them had been reclassified. We're going to get into exactly what that means, exactly how it works, and exactly why the version of it you've been trying to apply keeps falling apart under pressure. But first, sit with this. Think about the last time you held back. Not from laziness, from something quieter. The moment before a big decision, a high-stakes action, a commitment that would have moved everything forward, and something inside you pumped the brakes. What was that something protecting you from? Because the answer to that question is the exact thing we need to dismantle today. There is an invisible force operating inside you every time you approach something that matters. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't show up as fear with a face. It comes dressed as wisdom, as caution, as the reasonable voice that says, let's think about this carefully before we commit. Napoleon Hill called it one of the 6 basic fears, specifically the fear of poverty and the fear of criticism working in combination. But in the context of acting as if you cannot lose, it operates differently than most fear does. Most fear is loud. You can catch it, counter it, push through it with enough adrenaline and accountability. This fear is architectural. It is built into the way you frame every significant decision before you make it. Here is what it sounds like in practice. Before you make the call, send the proposal, launch the thing, raise the price, make the ask, your mind runs a probability calculation. Unconscious, automatic, fast. What are the chances this works? What happens if it doesn't? How bad will the failure feel? How much of my identity will be attached to the outcome? Can I survive being wrong about this? And if any of those answers come back unfavorable, if the probability feels low, if the failure feels too costly, if the identity risk feels too high, you don't move. Or you move smaller than you should. Or you move with a hedge built in a way to not fully commit, so that when it doesn't work, you can tell yourself you never really tried. This is the enemy, not fear itself. The specific mental architecture that makes losing feel like a permanent verdict rather than a temporary condition. Hill identified this in the men who never quite reached the level their talent warranted. Men who were brilliant and capable and hungry, but who moved through their entire careers at 70%, never all in, always with an exit clause, always with one foot positioned toward retreat. And he noticed something crucial about what that posture produced. Not safety, the opposite of safety, because the half-committed action, the one taken with a hedge, with an internal escape route, with part of your energy already allocated to managing the failure, produces inferior results. And inferior results confirm the fear. And confirmed fear demands a smaller action next time. And the smaller action produces even more inferior results. The person who never acts as if they cannot lose gets progressively more cautious over time. Not because they're weak, because the architecture of their decision-making makes caution feel like the only rational response to accumulating evidence of risk. They become, as Hill described it, a drifter, not directionless. Directionless would be obvious and correctable. A drifter, in Hill's definition, is someone who moves, works, tries, shows up, but without the kind of total commitment that actually moves the needle. And the most dangerous thing about being a drifter is that from the outside it looks exactly like trying. You are trying. That's not in question. But trying with your fingers crossed is not the same as acting as if the outcome is already decided. And the gap between those two, the gap between hoping it works and operating as though it will, is where most people's potential disappears. Here's what makes this enemy almost impossible to escape through conventional means. You can't argue yourself out of it, because the fear is not irrational. The risks are real. Failure is genuinely possible. Acting with total commitment and still not getting the result is a real thing that happens to real people. The fear isn't lying to you about the odds, it's lying to you about what the odds mean. And that distinction between accurate risk assessment and catastrophic interpretation of risk is the entire game. You can't win it by being braver. You can only win it by changing what losing means to you at the deepest level. And that requires something far more radical than courage. Here's what's actually happening inside your mind when you face a high-stakes decision. Not the conscious deliberation, the machinery underneath it. It's late or it's early, doesn't matter. You're alone with the decision and it has weight. The kind of weight that tells you this one is different. This one could actually change the trajectory. And for a few minutes you feel it, the possibility. The specific aliveness of standing at a real crossroads where both paths are real and the choice is real and the consequences are real, and then the machinery starts. Your mind begins pulling files. Every similar moment where you moved and it didn't work. Every time the risk felt worth it and the result said otherwise. Every version of this decision you've made before and the specific way each one ended, the files come fast. They don't announce themselves as fear. They present as experience, as data, as the accumulated wisdom of someone who has been here before. And the data says, be careful. So you add a condition. If X happens by this date, I'll go all in. If the first month shows Y result, I'll commit fully. If the response to this smaller version is strong enough, I'll take the bigger swing. You frame this as strategic, as measured, as the mature approach of someone who has learned from past mistakes. But what you've actually done is told yourself, and more importantly, told your subconscious that you do not believe this is going to work. And the subconscious takes that as its operating instruction. It begins filtering for evidence of failure, prioritizing information that confirms the cautious position, generating the subtle behavioral signals in your tone, your energy, your decision-making that communicate to everyone around you. I'm not fully committed to this. And people respond accordingly. The client who doesn't sign, the investor who passes, the partner who says they'll think about it. The opportunity that goes to someone less qualified but more certain. None of them can explain exactly why they chose the other person. They'll say things like chemistry, or timing, or fit. What they felt was frequency. The frequency of someone who hasn't decided yet. And here's the part that makes this psychological trap almost impossible to break. From the inside. Every time the cautious approach produces a cautious result, you interpret it as confirmation that caution was warranted. You didn't lose badly. You managed the risk. You protected yourself. What you actually did was guarantee a smaller life, not because caution is always wrong, but because acting as if you cannot lose is not a risk management strategy. It is an identity, and identities cannot be adopted conditionally. You cannot act as if you cannot lose only when the odds are good. That's not acting as if you cannot lose. That's acting confident when confidence is easy. The principle only becomes real, only begins producing the results Hill documented when you apply it in the moments when every rational signal says to pull back. Those moments are not the exception, they are the test. And the loop you've been stuck in, the try, hedge, get modest results, confirm the fear, try smaller. Next time loop has been running because you've been failing the test every time it arrives. Not from weakness, from an incomplete understanding of what the principle actually requires. Here is what you've tried instead, and why each of it fell short. You tried confidence building, you worked on your self-esteem, you accumulated wins deliberately, starting small and building up. You cataloged your achievements. You stood in front of the mirror and held the power pose and reminded yourself of your track record, and the confidence improved. Genuinely. But then you walked into a room where the stakes were higher than anything in your track record, and the confidence evaporated, because confidence built on past performance is always limited by past performance. It cannot extend into territory you haven't already proven yourself in. And the places where acting as if you cannot lose matters most are always in territory you haven't proven yourself in yet. Then you tried detachment. You studied the Stoics. You practiced non-attachment to outcomes. You told yourself that you controlled only the effort, not the result. And that peace lay in focusing entirely on the process. And there is profound truth in that, but you misapplied it. Detachment from outcome is not the same as acting as if you cannot lose. Detachment says, I release my grip on the result. Acting as if you cannot lose says, I move through this as if the result is already decided in my favor. Those are not the same posture. They produce different energy, different decisions, different results. The detached person is calm but passive. The person acting as if they cannot lose is calm and decisive. Hill watched both types. The detached ones found peace but rarely built empires. The ones acting from decided certainty built things that outlasted them. Then you tried the law of attraction approach. You focused on what you wanted. You visualized the outcome. You tried to feel the frequency of already having it and trust that the universe would close the gap. Again, not entirely wrong. Hill believed in the mechanics underlying this. But you were doing it as a supplementary practice rather than an operating system. You'd visualize in the morning and then spend the rest of the day operating from fear. Visualization didn't hold because it was surrounded by hours of contradictory signal. Your subconscious runs on the dominant emotional pattern, not the one you visit for 10 minutes at 6 a.m. And then there was the most seductive false solution of all. You decided you needed more preparation, more knowledge, more credentials, more experience, more evidence that you were ready before you moved as though you were ready. And the preparation felt like progress because it was activity. Directed, purposeful, intelligent activity. But Hill identified this as one of the most common ways talented people waste decades. Preparing for a fight they keep postponing. The preparation was never the problem. The decision to act as if the outcome was already settled. That was always the missing piece. And no amount of preparation can manufacture that decision for you. Because it's not a skill, it's a choice. And the choice requires you to Give up something you've been holding on to very tightly. The right to be cautious until you have enough proof. Here is what Napoleon Hill actually observed. The men who moved through the world as if they could not lose were not delusional. They were not ignoring risk. They were not unaware of the possibility of failure. They had simply made a deeper calculation than the one most people make. Most people calculate, what is the probability this works? And is that probability high enough to justify the risk? The men Hill studied calculated something different. What is the cost of not acting as if this works? And can I afford that cost? The first calculation is about protecting yourself from failure. The second is about protecting yourself from a life of almost. And when you run the second calculation honestly, when you genuinely count the cost of moving through your entire life at 70%, of always having the hedge built in, of always managing the downside instead of committing to the upside, the risk calculus changes completely. The risk is not in acting as if you cannot lose. The risk is in never finding out what happens if you do. Hill called this shift the development of a definite major purpose combined with the psychology of the pleasing mental attitude, but stripped of the dated language. What he meant was this: the person who acts as if they cannot lose has made a specific internal agreement. The agreement is not, I will succeed at this specific thing. The agreement is, I am someone who moves through the world from a position of committed certainty, and I will continue to be that person, regardless of what any individual result says. That agreement changes everything, because it removes the result from the center of your identity. You are no longer defined by whether this particular thing works. You are defined by how you move. And when you are defined by how you move, not by what you achieve, failure loses its power over you. Not because it doesn't hurt. It still hurts. But it cannot redefine you. And a failure that cannot redefine you is not the same threat as a failure that can. Your decisions change. Your energy changes. The signal you broadcast to every room you walk into changes. Tell me in the comments, what is the one move you've been preparing for that you haven't made yet? The one that's been ready longer than you want to admit. I want to know. Now let's build the actual system. The internal architecture that makes acting as if you cannot lose a permanent operating condition rather than a temporary emotional state. The first principle is what Hill called the mastermind of one, and it is the foundation everything else rests on. Before you can act as if you cannot lose in the external world, you have to stop the war inside your own mind. Most people operate with a deeply divided internal committee. Part of them believes, part of them doubts, part of them is all in, part of them is quietly planning the exit. And these parts argue, constantly burning energy, creating hesitation, producing the tentative, half-committed action that guarantees mediocre results. Hill's observation was that the men who moved with genuine, unstoppable certainty had achieved something most people never do: internal consensus. Not the silencing of doubt, not the suppression of fear. A genuine resolution of the internal debate, a decision so complete that the doubting parts of the mind had been heard, acknowledged, and overruled. Not ignored, overruled. There is a crucial difference. When you ignore the doubt, it goes underground and operates covertly, showing up as hesitation you can't explain, as self-sabotage that looks like bad luck, as the subtle behavioral signals that tell the world you're not fully committed. When you overrule the doubt, when you genuinely hear it, consider it, and then consciously choose certainty anyway, it loses its covert power. It can still speak, but it no longer drives. The practical shift is this: before any significant commitment, sit alone with the doubt and give it the floor. Ask it, what is the worst realistic outcome here? What would that cost me? Can I survive it? Almost always the answer is yes. And once you've genuinely established that you can survive the worst realistic outcome, The decision to act as if you cannot lose becomes not delusional, but logical. Because you've just proven to yourself that even losing doesn't mean losing everything. But the internal consensus only holds if the second principle is operating. And this one is where the real difficulty lives. Hill called it the habit of decision, and he observed that the people who acted with the most certainty were not the ones who made the best decisions. They were the ones who made decisions the fastest and held them the longest. Speed of decision and firmness of commitment. Most people do the opposite. They deliberate slowly, gathering information, consulting opinions, running scenarios, and then hold their decisions loosely, ready to reverse at the first sign of resistance. Hill found this combination lethal to momentum, because slow decision-making signals to your subconscious that the situation is genuinely uncertain, that all available information must be gathered before movement is safe. And the subconscious responds to that signal by generating anxiety, by scanning for threats, by putting you in a state of permanent evaluation that makes committed action almost impossible. Fast decision-making, even imperfect fast decision-making, signals something different. It signals that you are in control, that you trust your own judgment, that the situation does not require you to gather permission from every available source before you move. And that signal changes your internal state fundamentally. The mental shift here is uncomfortable because it requires you to tolerate imperfect information. Stop waiting to be certain before you decide. Decide, and then become certain through the act of committing. Certainty is not a prerequisite for decision. It is a product of decision. The third principle is what I call the incombustible frame, and Hill described it through the stories of men who faced catastrophic failure and emerged not just intact but stronger. The difference between the people who came back from total loss and the people who never recovered was not resilience in the conventional sense. It was the frame through which they interpreted the loss. The people who recovered had a frame that was incombustible. Failure could not set it on fire, not because they were emotionally invulnerable, but because their frame for what failure meant was fundamentally different. To them, failure was not a verdict. It was not evidence about their worth, their capability, or their future potential. It was friction, the specific resistance that exists between where you are and where you're going. Expected, normal, necessary. A carpenter doesn't feel personally attacked by the resistance of wood against the plane. The resistance is not punishment. It's the nature of the material. The people Hill studied had developed that same relationship with failure. It was the nature of the material they were working with. Not pleasant, not desirable, but not meaningful beyond its immediate practical content. What went wrong? What needs to change? What does this tell me about the next move? Those questions asked without identity attachment are the incombustible frame in action. The mental shift is precise. Every time a failure arrives, ask 3 questions before you allow yourself to feel anything about what it means. What specifically failed? What was the controllable cause? What is the single adjustment that addresses it? 3 questions. Practical, immediate, forward-pointing. Then feel whatever you need to feel. But feel it after the frame has been installed, not before, because the frame you install in the first 60 seconds after a failure determines whether the failure becomes data or becomes identity. The fourth principle is what Hill called the power of the pleasing mental attitude in negotiation, and it explains why acting as if you cannot lose produces results that have nothing to do with luck. When you enter a high-stakes interaction, a negotiation, a pitch, a conversation that could change your trajectory, you are broadcasting a signal before you speak. The signal is either, I need this, or I am offering this. Those 2 signals produce completely different responses in the people across from you. The person who needs the deal will unconsciously communicate that need through micro signals, the speed of their concessions, the tightness in their explanation, the way they watch for approval between each point. The person acting as if they cannot lose communicates something different. Not arrogance, not indifference. The specific energy of someone who genuinely does not need the outcome more than they need their own integrity. And that energy, that frequency of someone who has enough, who knows their value, who will walk away without drama if the terms don't work, is the single most persuasive force in any negotiation. Not because it plays games, because it's real. You cannot fake this. Hill was explicit about that. The pleasing mental attitude that makes you magnetic in high-stakes situations cannot be manufactured through technique. It can only be generated by genuinely operating from the internal position that you cannot lose. Because even if this specific thing doesn't work, you are still who you are, still moving the direction you're moving, still building what you're building. This particular moment is not the whole story. And when you genuinely feel that when it is not a performance but an actual internal orientation, the room changes. The fifth principle is the one that makes all others permanent. Hill called it the habit of rendering more service than is paid for, but in the context of acting as if you cannot lose, it means something specific. The person who acts as if they cannot lose is not someone who plays not to lose. They play to build something that outlasts any single outcome. Every action they take is oriented not toward the immediate result, but toward the kind of person they are becoming through the consistent quality of their effort. This orientation removes desperation from the equation entirely, because the person focused on building something durable, on becoming someone of genuine excellence, is not dependent on any single result going their way. The client who says no doesn't change who they are. The deal that falls through doesn't change what they're building. The month that goes wrong doesn't change the direction they're moving. Each of those outcomes is a single data point in a much longer story. And when you are genuinely living inside the longer story, when your identity is anchored to the builder rather than to any particular building, the short-term result loses its power to shake you. Acting as if you cannot lose is not a state you achieve. It is a practice you maintain. In the moments when it's easy and the moments when it isn't. But what comes next, what happens when you've understood all of this and started applying it, is something nobody warns you about. You will begin to change, and the world around you will resist it. Not loudly, in the specific ways that the people and situations in your life have been calibrated to the old version of you. You will walk into a room with different energy, and people will notice without being able to say what's different. Some will lean in, some will pull back. The ones who pull back are the ones whose relationship with you was built on the version of you that was uncertain. Your certainty makes them uncomfortable. You will make a decision faster than usual. A real decision from the new place, and the old internal committee will convene immediately afterward. Are you sure? Shouldn't you gather more information? What if you're wrong? You will feel the pull to reopen the decision, to add the hedge back in, to reintroduce the conditional clause that keeps you safe. You will resist it. And the resistance will feel like arrogance, like recklessness, like you're pretending to be someone you haven't earned the right to be yet. That feeling is the old identity fighting for its survival. It will be loudest right after your first real success with the new approach. Because success is more threatening to the old identity than failure is. Failure confirms the old story. Success threatens to replace it. And the old identity will work harder to undermine a success than it ever worked to soften a failure. You will find reasons why the success doesn't count, why it was luck, why it can't be repeated, why the next one will be different. You will feel the urge to hedge the next decision even harder than before. This is not weakness. This is the predictable, inevitable response of an identity that is losing ground. And it will happen again and again. Each time you break through to a new level, each time the new approach produces results the old approach never could. The war doesn't end. It just moves to higher ground. And the only way forward is to keep acting from the new place. Not perfectly. Not without the doubt. With it. Through it. Despite it. Every time you make the committed move, when everything in you wants to hedge, you add another brick to the architecture that cannot be shaken. The person you're becoming, the one who genuinely acts as if they cannot lose, doesn't look the way movies tell you they look. They're not loud, not brash, not performing certainty for an audience. They are quiet in a way that has weight. When they walk into a negotiation and the other side pushes back hard, tries to reduce the price, reframe the terms, create urgency that isn't real, they don't tighten. They get quieter because they've already run the only calculation that matters. They know their value. They know what they'll accept. They know what they'll walk away from. And they have no anxiety about walking away. That freedom, the freedom of someone who genuinely doesn't need the deal more than they need their integrity, is the most powerful position in any room. When failure arrives, and it still arrives, it always will, they process it differently than they used to. Not faster in the sense of burying it, faster in the sense of extracting what's useful and releasing what isn't. The failure is real. The disappointment is real, but it lands in a different place than it used to. It lands in the part of them that learns, not the part that doubts. They make decisions from the question, what does the person I've decided to be do here? Not what is the safe option. Not what will people think. Not what if this doesn't work? What does the person I've decided to be do here? That question asked honestly, answered honestly, produces a different action every time. And those different actions, compounded over months and years, produce a different life. Not a perfect one, a decided one. Here is how this ends, not with a summary. With a choice you've been postponing. You now understand at a level deeper than you did before this started why acting as if you cannot lose is not a performance. It is a decision about who you are in relation to uncertainty. And that decision is either made or it isn't. There is no partial version, no trial run. No. I'll try this for a month and see if it feels more natural. The moment you install the exit clause, you've already chosen the old architecture. Napoleon Hill watched men stand exactly where you're standing right now. Some of them made the decision. Their names are in history books. Some of them didn't. Their names are in no one's mouth. The difference was not talent, not timing, not luck. It was the willingness to stop treating their potential as a question. You either know who you are and move accordingly, or you spend the rest of your life gathering evidence trying to find out. The evidence will never be enough. It never is. The decision comes first, always. If you're ready to stop moving through your life with your fingers crossed, put it in the comments. One sentence, what you're committing to. Not for me. As a record for the version of you that will read it 6 months from now and need to be reminded. And if this is the content that your mind has been starving for, the kind that doesn't flatter you, doesn't make it easy, doesn't let you leave feeling good without leaving changed, you already know what to do. The version of you that cannot lose is not waiting for permission, it's waiting for a decision.